Hey guys, how's it going today? Will Mahan here with Saberroon Design Tutorial Blog, welcoming you to another Photoshop CS6 tutorial. In today's tutorial, we'll be making a photorealistic crayon. There's a lot of stuff going on in this tutorial, but the main focus is how you can use maps to manipulate different elements of the environment to achieve two completely different effects simultaneously in different areas of the same surface. For example, if you take a quick peek at this sample image, you'll notice that the exposed ends of the crayon are very shiny, almost reflective, while the paper area remains relatively dull. It does give off a faint shine where the lighting is strongest, but it's nothing even approaching reflectivity, which is more or less the way light would react to an object like this in the real world. Even though those two objects are reacting differently to the light, they are actually part of the same element on the object, the extrusion. We change the behavior across the element using maps. If you have any experience using alpha channels for opacity control or height mapping, the maps are going to look very familiar to you right away, and in fact, they work in exactly the same way. They use varying degrees of gray, ranging from pure black to pure white, to fine-tune an effect. We could probably spend literally hours discussing the theory behind mapping, but for our purposes, I think the best policy would be to just dive right into it. So here we go. Go ahead and start a new project by clicking File and New and setting your size at 2000 by 2000 with a resolution of 100 and click OK. Now, the first thing we need to do is set up our vector shape, which will be the source for our 3D object. Let's start by resetting the foreground and background swatches by hitting the D key, then filling the canvas with gray by clicking Shift and Backspace so we can see our work path. Choose 50% gray and click OK. Now it's time to lay out the guides. Toggle your rulers to visible by clicking Ctrl R. Right-click on the ruler and set its dimensions to pixels. Next, left-click directly on the left-hand ruler and drag out a vertical guide and drop it on pixel number 1000, which is at the center of the canvas, holding Shift as you do to snap it to the pixel grid. Now that we've done that, let's look at a different way to place guides. Since we have several guides and their placement needs to be precise, dragging and dropping them manually can get pretty tedious. It requires a lot of zooming and panning, and in this case, I think we'd be ahead if we avoid that. So go ahead and go to View and click New Guide. Click the vertical bullet and set your position to 973 and click OK. And you'll see it created a new guide for us exactly where we want it. But since that is somewhat buried in a sub-menu, even that can become tedious after enough times. If you're only doing it once, no problem, but if you got to do it 10 or 20 or 50 times, then yeah, clicking through that menu gets to be a lot of hard work. So here's a little bonus nugget to this tutorial. Go up to Window, open up the Workspace sub-menu and choose Keyboard Shortcuts and Menus. Click on the Keyboard Shortcuts tab, scroll down, and expand the View menu. Now scroll down all the way to the bottom and click and select New Guide. And as soon as you click it, a field will automatically open up, allowing you to type in the keyboard shortcut of your choice. Now I've selected Control-Alt-Shift-G because as far as I know, that's not being used anywhere else in Photoshop, so it won't cancel out any of the other existing keybinds. Now once you've got that set, go ahead and click the Accept button and then click OK. Now that we have a handy shortcut set up, let's go ahead and use it. Holding Control, Shift, and Alt, hit the G key to bring up the Create a New Guide interface. Verify that the vertical bullet is set and type in pixel number 939 and click OK. Repeat that process for pixels number 924, pixel 919, and finally pixel 914. Next, let's lay out the horizontal guides in the exact same way. Hold down Control Shift and Alt and hit the G key to bring up the new guide interface. This time, in the orientation field, click the horizontal button and type in the position of 39 and click OK. Repeat that for pixel number 236, pixel number 243, pixel number 289, pixel number 1896, pixel number 1960, and finally pixel number 1962. Now that we have our guides laid out, let's grab the pen tool and draw out our vector shape. Go ahead and zoom in at the upper right hand area of our guide layout, and starting at the upper right intersection, click and drag to the left to place a point. After you've started dragging, hold down the Shift key to lock your handles at 90 degrees. Drag it to about here, release your click, and release Shift. Now move over to the next guide intersection, this time holding Shift before you place your point to lock this anchor on the same horizontal pixel as the previous anchor. Click and release to place that point, and then release Shift. Now let's move down to the next intersection. Now on this intersection we want to hold down the Alt key before we place our anchor, and the reason is by default the handles on the anchors are connected, and on this particular anchor we don't want that to happen. By holding down the Alt key before we place the anchor, it will break the handle's connection, and as you can see, the line on the previous side of the anchor is unaffected when I rotate the handle on this side of the anchor. Now once you've dragged the handle out a few pixels, hold down the Shift key to lock it at 90 degrees, drag it out to about there, release your click, and release the modifiers. Now moving over to the next intersection, place a new anchor, this time holding Shift before you click to lock it on the same horizontal pixel as the previous anchor. Click and drag out about 2 pixels, release your click, and release your Shift. Now go to the next intersection, this time clicking before you press any modifiers. Click and drag straight down about 2 pixels, holding Shift as you do to lock it at 90 degrees. Release your click. At the next intersection, hold down Shift and Alt before you click. Click at the intersection and drag straight to the left, just a couple of pixels. Release your click and release your modifiers. At the next intersection, do the exact same thing. Hold down Shift and Alt, click, but this time drag straight down a few pixels, release your click, and release the modifiers. Now let's move our view down to the bottom end of the guides, and at the next intersection, place a new anchor, this time holding Shift and Alt before you place it. Click and drag to the right a couple of pixels. Release your click and release the modifiers. Repeat the process again for the next intersection, this time dragging straight down about 2 or 3 pixels. Release your click and release the modifier. At the next intersection, hold down Shift before you click. Click and drag straight down about 2 pixels and release your click. Go to the next intersection without holding any modifiers, click and drag straight to the right about 2 pixels, and then hold down Shift to make sure that it locks at 90 degrees. Release your click and release the modifier. Now go over to the lower right hand guide intersection, holding down Shift and Alt before you click. Click on the intersection and drag straight up a few pixels. Release your click and release your modifiers. Now pan all the way back up to the top of the guides. Hold down Shift and Alt and then click on the very first guide that we placed to complete the work path. Now go ahead and hit Control and 0 to fit the canvas on the screen. Press Ctrl and semicolon to hide the guides, and you should end up with a work path that resembles half a crayon. Now it's time to create our 3D shape. Go to the 3D menu and choose New 3D Extrusion from Selected Path. Now, if it's not already, go ahead and take a moment to set up your 3D workspace like mine. It doesn't have to look exactly like this, but make sure you can see the 3D panel and the Properties panel at the same time. It's a real hassle to toggle back and forth, so avoid it if you can. Now, in the 3D panel, click on the Layer 1 Mesh layer, which is the one with the little extruded star icon. And in the Properties panel, click on the Deform icon and set the horizontal angle to 360 degrees. And set the extrusion depth at 272. Next, in the 3D panel, click on the Layer 1 Extrusion Material layer to activate its options in the Properties panel. In the Properties panel, find the area labeled as Diffuse and click on the Color field to bring up the color picker. Change that color to red and click OK. Click the color field next to the specular label and change its color to 70% gray and click OK. Change the shine to 31%. Change the reflection to 25%. Change the bump to 35%. And change the refraction to 1.460. Now, we haven't saved our project yet, so now would be a good time to do that. Go to File, Save As, choose a destination folder, and name this Red Crayon. And click Save. And that's got our base started. Now we need to start creating and adding maps to manipulate the various effects, but let's get a background layer going first. While holding down Control, click the Create a New Layer icon in the bottom of the Layers panel. If you don't already know, by default, Photoshop creates new layers at the top of the stack. By holding down Control, we force it to create the new layer below the active layer. Now click the New Fill or Adjustment Layer icon and choose Pattern. Click the little arrow here next to the preview window to open up the pattern picker. Click the little gear-shaped icon to open up the submenu and choose the Colored Paper Pattern Set. Click OK or Append, depending on your preferences, and select the Buff Textured pattern. Set your scale at 250% and click OK. Now click on Layer 1 to reactivate the 3D layer, and let's get to work on our maps. First, let's load an image-based light. To load the IBL, click on the Environment layer in the 3D panel and click directly on the IBL to bring up the submenu. Now you can either create your own if you know how, or you can use the one that I have provided. Let's leave that as it is for now. We'll tweak it a little bit later. Click on the Layer 1 Extrusion Material layer to activate it. Click the icon next to the Diffuse Color field and choose Edit Texture. And what we want to do here is to get the size of our texture to something that's close to proportionate. If we don't, our diffuse will be distorted when we go to apply it to the mesh. If you're a real stickler, you could get yourself a crayon and try to calculate the exact proportions, but for our purposes, I think a good guess will do. As a rough guess, I would say that if we unfolded a crayon and laid it out flat, it would be approximately 5 times longer than it is wide. So let's go with that and see how we end up. Click Image, Image Size, uncheck the Constraint Proportions box, change your width to 2000, and your height to 1/5 of that, which is 400 pixels, and click OK. Now click the 3D menu, go down to Create Painting Overlay, and choose Wireframe. This is a UV unwrap that will serve as our guide as we lay out our textures. The vertical lines in the wireframe represent changes in the angles on the mesh, which will make it easier for us to position our texture exactly where we want it. Our crayon is red, so our label will be red too. Usually though, the labels are a slightly lighter shade than the actual crayon. So let's go ahead and change our foreground color to reflect that. Click the foreground icon to bring up the color picker. And in this field down here at the bottom of the picker, type in color code CE3D4E, which is sort of a magenta color. And go ahead and click OK. Next, grab your rectangle shape tool and draw out a rectangle in this general area here, making sure that it reaches from the bottom to the top of the canvas. Next, let's zoom in close to the right-hand side of our rectangle so that you can clearly see this vertical line in the wireframe guide. Now, the right side of the image corresponds to the bottom of our crayon mesh. As I said before, the vertical lines in the wireframe represent changes to the angle in our mesh. If you'll remember back when we first drew out the vector path, we had two angle changes at the bottom. The first angle is for the edge of the label that wraps around the crayon. The second angle was for the slight bevel at the bottom edge of the crayon. So what we want to do is line up the magenta colored shape with the edge of the crayon label. So go ahead and slide the shape over so that it's aligned with the right hand edge of this vertical line in the wireframe right here. Now let's pan over to the right side of our rectangle. And this vertical line represents the top of our crayon label. So let's go ahead and hit Control T to go into free transform mode. Grab the left hand transform and drag it over until it's aligned with the left edge of that vertical line, and click OK to commit those changes. Now let's tab back over to our main document and let's see if our label is aligned properly. In the 3D panel, go ahead and click the current view layer to take control of the camera. And let's move the camera around a little bit to verify that our label is lined up the way we want it to be. You'll notice that the wireframe has also been drawn, and that's okay. We're still in the construction process and it will be removed eventually. As you can see, the edges are lined up exactly the way we want. So go ahead and click back on the Layer 1 Extrusion Material document, and let's finish up our diffuse. Go ahead and hit Control 0 to zoom out so we can see the entire document. Go over to the Layers panel, select both layers that are labeled Layer 1, and delete those. Next, while holding down the Control key, click on the Rectangle 1 layer, but make sure you click directly on the icon, and that will place a bounding box around the entire shape on the canvas. In the bottom of the Layers panel, click the Create New Fill or Adjustment layer and choose Pattern. Select the Buff Textured pattern again. This time, set the scale to 170% and click OK. Now back in the Layers panel, click and change its blending mode to Overlay. Next, let's create the stripes that go around the ends of the labels. These can be anything you want, but for this tutorial we'll stick with the standard negative space wave. Click on the Create New Layer icon at the bottom of the Layers panel. Pick up the Rectangle Shape tool and change the fill color to black. Create a narrow rectangle that runs from the top to the bottom of the canvas, like so. Now go over to the toolbar and click on the Pen tool to bring up the flyout menu and choose the Add Anchor Point tool. Now double click on the ruler to bring up the Preferences panel. Click on Guides, Grid, and Slices and set your grid lines to every 80 pixels and click OK. Now hit Control and comma to bring up the visibility on the guide. Now with our Add an Anchor Point tool, go down the right hand edge of the black stripe and add a new anchor everywhere the path intersects the grid. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now go over to the toolbar and hold down the Path Selection tool until the flyout menu appears and choose Direct Selection tool. Counting down from the top, click and select point number 2. Hold down the Shift key and click and select point number 4. Holding down the Shift key, click and select point number 6. Release the Shift key, click and drag any one of those selected points to the left. Press the Shift key again to lock it at 90 degrees and drag them until they are about in the center of the black square. Release click and release Shift. Now toggle the grid back off by holding down Control and comma. Next, hold down Control and click in the center of the black shape to switch from the Direct Select tool to the Path Select tool. Now while holding down Alt, click in the center of the shape and drag it to the right. After you begin dragging, hold down Shift to constrain it and drop it about right there. Right click on the new shape and choose Free Transform Path. Right click again and choose Flip Vertical. Right click one more time and choose Flip Horizontal. And press OK to commit the changes. Now while holding down Shift, click on the first black shape to select them both. Go up to the top and click the Path Operations button and choose Merge Shape Components. Next, let's duplicate the stripe by holding down the Alt key, clicking and drag to the right to duplicate it. Hold down Shift as you drag to constrain it to the horizontal axis and drop it so that it closely matches the first stripe. Next, we want to change the opacity of this layer to 90%. Yes, it's black and it's supposed to be clearly legible, but if left at 100%, it sort of looks like it's floating and not really part of the label. If we set it to 90%, it's still pretty dark and just enough so the label will shine through so it looks like a single element. Now let's tab back over to our original document and see how things look so far. So far so good, but before we go any further, let's reposition our mesh so it's in a more realistic pose. Click on the Layer 1 Mesh in the 3D panel. Go down to the Properties panel and click the Coordinates button. In the Rotation column, change the X rotation angle to 90 degrees. In the 3D panel, click the submenu icon and choose Snap Object to Ground Plane. Click on the current view layer, grab your Move tool, and then reposition your camera. Something like that ought to do. That'll work. Now click on the Infinite Light 1 layer and move the light so that it is shining down from above and slightly behind. In the Properties panel, change the shadow softness to 60%. And let's go ahead and save our project because it's been a while since we've done that. And now let's evaluate what we have. So far so good. The label is lined up properly, the stripes are in a good place, and overall things are coming together nicely. It's a long way from perfect though. The first thing that sticks out is how shiny the label is. Paper does have some specularity, but it shouldn't be all glossy like a piece of plastic. We'll fix that soon enough, but for now, let's go ahead and finish up the diffuse pattern for the label. Tab back over to the Layer 1 Extrusion Material document. Now let's quickly place a couple of guides. Now using the keybind that we made earlier, hold down Control, Shift, Alt, and G to bring up the new guide dialog. Leaving the horizontal bullet checked, type in a position of 241 and click OK. Open up the dialog box again and create a guide at position number 364 and click OK. I'll bring up the guide one more time, this time checking the vertical bullet, and set the position at 1465 and click OK. Bring up the dialog again and set the position this time to 1813 and click OK. Click the Shape tool to bring out the flyout menu and choose the Ellipse tool. If it's not already, set your fill to black. and drag out an oval so that it fits inside the box we just created with our guides. Real quickly, let's tab over to the main document and make sure we're happy with the positioning. Okay, I think that'll work. So tab back over to the diffuse document, grab the horizontal type tool, set the color to white so we can see what we're doing. Now set your font to whatever you like. I'm using Adobe MT Condensed. Left click on the canvas to create a new text layer and type out the word Crayon. Click OK to commit the change. Now grab your Move tool, move the font on top of the oval, and resize it to fit. Next, in the Layers panel, right-click on the text layer and choose Convert to Shape. Go over and grab the Path tool, click on the letter C to select it. Holding down the Shift key, click and select each one of the rest of the letters, being careful not to select the oval behind them. In the toolbar, click the Path Operations button and choose Merge Shape Components. While the text layer is active, hold down Shift and click the Ellipse 1 layer. Right-click and choose Merge Shapes. Once combined in a single layer, both shapes will become the same color. In this case, the color of the text layer supersedes. Not to worry, we'll fix that in a minute. With both shapes still selected, in the toolbar, click the Path Alignment button and choose Align Vertical Centers. Click the Path Alignment button again and choose Align Horizontal Centers. Now click in an empty part of the canvas and let's take a look at what we've got. It looks like the C is really close to the edge of the oval, so let's manually move it around a little bit. Click on the letter shape and use the arrow keys to fine-tune its position. Okay, I think that'll work. Now select both the letters and the oval by holding down Shift and clicking the oval. Now click the Path Operations button and choose the Exclude Overlapping Shapes option. Click the Path Operations button again and choose Merge Shape Components. Now with the shape still selected, go up to the Fill panel and change its color to black. And just like with the stripes, change its opacity to 90%. And finally, right-click on the shape, choose Free Transform Path, and rotate it around 180 degrees, and click OK to commit the change. Now let's click on our main document and take a look at it. So far so good. Everything seems to be proportioned properly. So let's go ahead and tab back over to the diffuse document, close it, and save if prompted. Now this is a good time to save our work, so go ahead and do that by holding down Control and hitting the S key. And now it's time to move on to the bump mapping. In the main document in the 3D panel, click on the Layer 1 Extrusion Material layer. In the Properties panel, go down to the bump field and click the icon and choose Load Texture. Navigate to the Crayon bump.jpg that I have made available and load it. Now let's work on the reflection map. Go over to the reflection field and click the folder shaped icon and choose New Texture. Set your document size to 2000 by 400 so that it matches our diffuse and click OK. Click the icon again, this time choosing Edit Texture. Go up to the 3D menu, go down to Create Painting Overlay and choose Wireframe so that Photoshop will make a new guide for us. Now real quickly, just to go over what we're doing here. Rough construction paper does have a little specularity, but it's going to have what amounts to zero reflectivity. As of right now, our crayon looks a little bit silly with the label being all shiny, and it's nowhere near photorealistic because of that. The caveat to the whole thing is we're using the same diffuse color to color both our label and the shiny wax that the crayon is made out of. So we can't just adjust the numbers. If we do, the wax won't be shiny anymore. So we're going to use a map to sort of shield parts of the mesh from our overall settings. As I said earlier, it works in the exact same principle as using an alpha channel to manipulate transparency. In this case, pure white or full transparency is going to have no effect on the texture. In other words, where there's transparency, the numbers in the field of the properties pane will determine the effect. On the other end of that, pure black will completely nullify whatever numbers are in the field, forcing them to return a value of 0 for the areas that are covered in black. Using shades of gray will allow a partial effect depending on how dark that shade is. For this particular application, I think it's safe to say that the label will have virtually no reflectivity, so what we need to do is cover the label area of the diffuse with a pure black square. We'll do that the same way we created the label diffuse. Grab the rectangle shape tool and set its fill to black, and go ahead and align this square in the exact same way that we aligned the label earlier. Now grab your move tool, zoom in on the right hand side of the square, and align the right edge of the square with the right edge of the vertical line on the wireframe. Pan over to the left side and align the left edge of the square with the left edge of that vertical line in the wireframe. Click the check mark to commit the changes. Delete both layers that are labeled Layer 1. Close the document, and when prompted to save, choose Yes. The reflectivity is now gone from the label, but still remains on the waxy parts of the crayon, making for a much more realistic effect. The label is still a little too shiny though, so let's go ahead and address that. In the 3D panel, click on the Layer 1 extrusion material. In the Properties panel, take a look at the Roughness field. Basically, roughness determines how much a surface distorts reflection and specularity. Think of it as a bathroom mirror. A perfectly clean mirror would return a perfect reflection. However, if you take a hot shower, then try to look in the mirror again, it's all steamy and your reflection is scattered and much less clear. It's still there, but now it's all hazy and hard to make out the details. Well, that's basically how roughness works. At 0% roughness, the reflection is flawless. At 50% roughness, the mirror is all foggy, and as a consequence, so is the reflection. Click on the icon next to the roughness field and choose New Texture. Set the size the same as before, 200 by 400, and click OK. Click the icon again, this time choosing Edit Texture. This works essentially the same as before, but we have to come at it exactly backwards. We don't want any roughness on the waxy parts, so this time, instead of having a clear or white background, we want it to be totally black, so that it won't apply any effect to the wax. Reset your swatches by pressing the D key. Then while holding Alt, press Backspace to fill the canvas with black. Now go to the 3D menu, choose Create Painting Overlay, and again choose Wireframe. Hold down Control and press the I key to invert it so we can see the guides. Rough paper is a long way from glossy, but it still has some specularity. So instead of creating a box that's pure white, which would set the roughness for that area at 100%, we want to fill it with a shade of gray, which will apply a partial roughness to the shaded area. Pick up the rectangle shape tool and create a rectangle just as we did before. Change its fill color to 45% gray. Go ahead and grab the Move tool, zoom in on the right hand edge, and align the edge of the rectangle with the right hand edge of the vertical line just as we've done previously. Pan over to the left side. Make sure that it's aligned, and click OK to commit those changes. Now go ahead and select the Layer 1 layer that contains the wireframe and delete that. Close the document, and when prompted to save, choose Yes. Now, back to our main document. At first, it still looks like it's a little too shiny, but remember, we're still in interactive mode. In order to get our final result, we'll have to do a render. Grab the rectangle marquee tool and select a small area, and go ahead and hit the render button at the bottom of the 3D panel. You'll notice right away the specularity on the label begins to soften, while the specularity on the waxy area stays nice and crisp. I'll go ahead and click an empty place in the canvas to cancel the render. Hit Control D to remove your selection. And now it's time to add some finishing touches. In the 3D panel, click the Layer 1 Extrusion Material layer to activate it. And in the Properties panel, click the icon next to the Diffuse field and choose Edit Texture. In the texture document, activate the Crayon layer, and with the Move tool selected, move the oval down so that it's close to the bottom edge of the document, so that when we go back to our 3D document, it will appear to be rolled toward the back a slight amount. Go ahead and tab back over to the main document to see how it's looking. Okay, that'll work. In the Properties panel, find the Bump field and click the icon and choose Edit Texture. Tab over to the Diffuse layer, and with your Move tool selected, click and drag the oval on top of the Bump tab. After a second or so, the Bump tab texture will become the active document. Move the cursor down over the canvas, and you'll notice this little plus sign. This means that whatever we're holding, in this case the oval, will be added to the current document when we drop it. Before you drop it though, be sure to press and hold the Shift key. This will drop it in the exact location that it exists in the previous document, ensuring perfect alignment, which is exactly what we want since we're using this as a guide. Go ahead and drop the oval and release the Shift key. Now go over to the Tools palette, click and hold the Shape tool until the flyout menu appears and choose the Line tool. Set your weight to 1 pixel and then draw a single horizontal line from one edge of the gray to the other, holding Shift as you do to keep it locked horizontally. Now zoom in to the left side, grab your Move tool and align the edge with the edge of the gray. Now zoom in to the right side. Go into free transform mode by hitting Control and T and grabbing the right hand transform and dragging until it's aligned with the right edge of the gray area. Click the check mark to commit the change. Zoom back out, and with your arrow keys move the line until it is just above the oval. Click the Crayon layer to activate it and click the trash can icon at the bottom of the Layers panel to delete it. Close the document, and when prompted to save, choose Yes. Go ahead and close the Diffuse document as well. And now back on our main document, you can see that we've got this nice little seam where the edges of our label might overlap if this were a real crayon. Now one last thing, I want to give the image-based lights some last-minute adjustments. Something like that should probably work. And now we're ready for our final render. Before we do that, let's give it one last save. As usual, expect the final render to take some time, so sit back and relax and let Photoshop do all the work for you from here. But once you're finished, you should end up with something that looks about like this. And that's going to do it for this tutorial. As always, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.